A student suddenly disappeared, and the police got involved. At first, there were no clues and no clear direction, but soon the case took an unexpected turn that changed everything. And by the time detectives finally uncovered the truth, it was something no one could have imagined. Shannon Schieber was born on August 8, 1974, in Maryland. From the very beginning, she stood out as exceptionally bright. By a year and a half, she could recite the entire alphabet, forward and backward. And by 3, she was reading on her own. Shannon graduated high school with honors and went on to Duke University in North Carolina, where she earned a bachelor's degree in just 3 years, triple majoring in math, philosophy, and economics. After graduation, she spent a year at a finance firm, but her plan was always to keep studying. Shannon wanted to go into finance not to get rich, but to help people who were struggling to make ends meet, because fairness and equality really meant something to her. At 23, she got a full scholarship to the prestigious Wharton School, packed up for Pennsylvania, and moved into an apartment in the heart of Philadelphia so she could be close to campus while pursuing her doctorate. And she wasn't just about academics. Shannon was always active. She loved to swim, played lacrosse, and went horseback riding whenever she got the chance. On May 7, 1998, around 2 in the morning, Philadelphia police got a call from a man who lived in the same building as Shannon. He said he'd heard a woman screaming from her apartment, a sharp, terrified cry, followed by a desperate, "Help me." The neighbor stepped into the hallway and walked up to her door. By then, he could hear strange noises coming from inside, like someone gasping for air. He tried the handle, but the door was locked. When no one answered his knocks or calls, he grabbed the phone and dialed 911. While officers were on their way, the neighbor ran downstairs and knocked on a couple's apartment. He was thinking about breaking down Shannon's door, but knew he couldn't do it alone. Unfortunately, only the wife was home. Her husband was at work, so there was no one to help. A few minutes later, the police arrived, less than 5 minutes after the call. When they reached Shannon's door, everything had gone silent. They knocked several times, but there was no response. Thinking the place was empty, they hesitated to act. The neighbor insisted that the screams definitely came from Shannon's apartment, and another woman who lived just below said she'd heard banging sounds at the same time. But the officers figured the noise might have come from the street, and that the neighbor had just misjudged where it came from. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. It was still locked tight. One of the officers even went outside and shined his flashlight up towards Shannon's balcony. The curtains were drawn, and the door was shut. Putting all that together, they decided there wasn't enough reason to break in. Before leaving, they told the neighbors to call again if they heard anything else, and then drove off. The next morning, Shannon was supposed to meet up with some classmates to study for exams. Later that day, she had plans to grab coffee with her brother, but she never showed up to either. Worried, her brother drove over to her apartment. Right away, he noticed the balcony door was open, though the curtains were still drawn. He knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. With no cell phone, he drove over to a friend's place and called his mom. She told him to head back and ask Shannon's neighbors if anyone had a spare key, or to try getting in touch with the building manager. So he went back and started knocking on every door in the hallway, but most people weren't home. The first person to answer was the same neighbor who had called the police the night before. When Shannon's brother explained who he was and why he was there, the man's face immediately changed. He realized something was seriously wrong. He told him about the screams and the call he made to 911 just hours earlier. Together, they rushed to Shannon's apartment and forced the door open. What they saw inside was horrifying. Shannon was lying face down on her bed, completely naked, and it was immediately clear that she was dead. Police handed Shannon's body over to the medical examiners and began combing through the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door, so detectives figured the killer might have gotten in through the balcony. Her place was on the second floor, but there was a tree right next to the balcony that someone could have easily climbed. It even had a metal guard on it, but with enough skill, it wouldn't have been hard to get past. Inside the apartment, there were clear signs of a struggle. Books were scattered all over the floor near the bed, and there were bloodstains on the blanket, the walls, and even out on the balcony. It looked like Shannon had fought back hard, and possibly injured her attacker, since the blood trail leading outside seemed to belong to him. On the bed, investigators also found traces of semen, which they sent to the lab along with the blood sample for DNA testing. Detectives later realized that a few of Shannon's things were missing. The killer had taken a pin, a necklace, her backpack, a camera, and a stack of CDs. The medical examiners determined that Shannon had died from strangulation and also found signs of sexual assault. They discovered someone else's blood on her teeth. Apparently, she'd bitten her attacker hard enough to make him bleed. As for the time of death, the experts estimated it happened just minutes before her neighbor called the police, though it was impossible to pinpoint the exact moment. Still, one thing immediately stood out. When the police came that night, the balcony door was shut. But when Shannon's brother and the neighbor broke in the next morning, it was open. And since the neighbor had heard choking sounds before he even called 911, it meant Shannon was likely already dead by the time officers arrived at her door. In other words, the killer was probably still inside the apartment when police stood just a few feet away, and then slipped out afterward. The blood and semen found in Shannon's apartment were both tested, but the DNA belonged to an unknown man who wasn't in any database. Detectives also circulated a list of Shannon's stolen belongings, her pin, jewelry, backpack, camera, and CDs, to local pawn shops, hoping the killer might try to sell them, but nothing came up. They even looked into one of Shannon's classmates as a possible suspect, but his DNA didn't match the killer's. Another lead came from Shannon's friends and family. Just 2 days before she died, she told them about a strange man who had followed her on the street. She walked around the block a few extra times to make sure he didn't learn where she lived. Police didn't rule out that this could have been her killer, but the tip didn't bring them any closer to finding him. From that point on, the investigators hit a dead end. For months, there were no major developments, and detectives were no closer to finding the person responsible. That changed nearly a year later, when the case suddenly took a strange new turn. A man called the Philadelphia Inquirer, a local newspaper, claiming to have information about Shannon's murder. He wouldn't give his name, but said the police had completely missed something crucial. The case, he insisted, was connected to several other attacks on women that had happened in the same area. The journalists decided to look into it, and sure enough, they found that a series of eerily similar crimes had been taking place right in the heart of Philadelphia. On June 20th, 1997, a year before Shannon's murder, a man broke into a woman's apartment through a window and attacked her. He tried to force himself on her, but she managed to talk him out of it. As soon as he left, she called the police and even handed over a strand of his hair that had fallen on her bed. But for some reason, the police never sent it to the lab for testing. 3 weeks later, on July 11th, another woman came home from a party after drinking quite a bit. She fell asleep right away, but a few hours later she woke up to find that all her clothes were gone and her hair was soaking wet. She also had scratches on her neck and burst a blood vessel in her eyes. She reported it to police, but they labeled it as a burglary. Then, on August 6th, yet another woman was attacked in her apartment. A man climbed in through a window, covered her head with a pillow, wrapped a belt around her neck, and sexually assaulted her before fleeing. Investigators recovered DNA from the bedsheet, but since there wasn't yet a national FBI DNA database, they didn't compare it to other cases. A week later, on August 13th, a woman woke up to find a stranger standing in her bedroom. He sexually assaulted her and took off. This time, police collected DNA again, and when they finally compared it to the previous case from August 6th, it turned out to be an exact match. All of these women lived close to one another, some even on the same street. But for reasons that still baffle people to this day, police didn't classify most of these incidents as sexual assaults, so there was never a full investigation. As reporters dug deeper, they found that this wasn't just a fluke. It was common practice within the Philadelphia Police Department at the time. A huge number of rape reports weren't officially recorded as crimes. Many officers simply didn't believe the victims. In fact, some senior officials openly claim that half the women who report rape are lying. Eventually, the newspaper ran a story that blew the whole thing wide open, and it sparked a massive public outcry. The backlash forced police to review every sexual assault report that had never been classified as a crime, and in the process, they ended up reclassifying around 1,500 cases. The article also devoted significant attention to Shannon's murder, pointing out what now seemed like an obvious connection between her case and the earlier assaults, and calling out the police for failing to link them sooner. When Shannon first moved to Philadelphia for college, she'd chosen that apartment specifically because the neighborhood was considered safe, but neither she nor her neighbors had any idea that a serial predator was operating right under their noses, largely because police hadn't recognized the pattern in his attacks. After the article's release, investigators were forced to change their approach completely. Up until then, they'd focused mostly on the idea that Shannon's killer might have been someone she knew, perhaps an ex-boyfriend. But now, they compared the DNA from her murder to the samples taken from the sexual assault cases, and the results were unmistakable. They belonged to the same man. Still, the detectives had no clue who he was. They didn't even have a name. But there was one promising lead. One of the assault victims had seen her attacker's face and given police a description months earlier. Investigators used that to create a composite sketch, which they distributed to local newspapers, along with an announcement of a $40,000 reward for any information leading to the suspect's capture. The calls started pouring in, but every single lead hit a dead end. That went on until September 13th, when the attacker struck again, this time targeting another woman in the same area. He assaulted her, but once again managed to slip away before police could catch him. Not long after, one of the detectives working Shannon's case happened to catch a TV episode about investigators who'd solved a crime using something called geographic profiling. The idea was simple but interesting. Experts analyzed the location of crimes committed by the same offender and used that pattern to pinpoint where he's most likely living. The team reached out to the same specialist featured in that show, and he put together a map highlighting the areas where their suspect might be based. Detectives hit those neighborhoods, plastering flyers with a composite sketch and talking to residents, but none of it led anywhere. After that, the attacks suddenly stopped. For months, there wasn't a single new report, and detectives started to think the man who terrorized the city had finally gone underground. That pattern continued until the middle of 2000, when detectives noticed a request that had come in from their colleagues at the Colorado Police Department. Investigators there had sent out a nationwide bulletin about a string of sexual assaults that had taken place in the city of Fort Collins, nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia. The moment the Philadelphia team saw the report, something clicked. The attacker's methods were nearly identical to those of their elusive killer. He broke into apartments where women were home alone, assaulted them, and then vanished. What's more, he left behind several DNA samples and a fingerprint. Investigators in Philadelphia asked for those samples to be compared with the ones recovered from Shannon's apartment, and the results came back as a perfect match. Their killer had moved clear across the country and kept attacking women. For the first time, police finally had a real shot at uncovering his identity. They decided to dig into credit card transaction data from both sets of crimes, the ones in Philadelphia and Fort Collins, hoping to find people whose cards had been used in both cities around the time of the assaults. It wasn't an easy task, but after combing through thousands of records, they narrowed it down to a list of 319 men between the ages of 20 and 30 whose cards had been active in both places during the attacks. Then, using the geographic profiling map, they focused on certain Philadelphia neighborhoods where the suspect was likely to have lived, shrinking that list even further, down to just 83 names. They sent that narrowed list over to their colleagues in Colorado, who started checking whether any of those names might be connected to the assaults. But before they can make progress, the attacker struck again. Not long after, a letter arrived at the same police station. It read, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you catch me just yet. I'm not in Colorado anymore. I didn't even like it there. I'm not a fan of the cold, and I don't plan on coming back to Fort Collins. I have to admit, you guys are everywhere. I want you to catch me, because I hate what I'm doing. It keeps me away from people, and I don't have anyone to talk to. Sometimes, I get really lonely." The letter also included details about several assaults that only investigators would know about, confirming it had been written by the attacker himself. Still, there were no fingerprints or DNA anywhere on it. Detectives believed the letter was meant to throw them off, that maybe he was lying about leaving Fort Collins. But even with that theory, they were no closer to catching him, and time was running out. The biggest issue was the statute of limitations for sexual assault in Pennsylvania, just 5 years. The first known attacks dated back to 1997, which meant police had less than 2 years left to bring justice to Philadelphia victims, even though the murder of Shannon Schieber would carry a life sentence, or worse, no matter when he was caught. Detectives kept reaching out to the public for help, and over the course of the investigation, they got thousands of calls. And finally, in 2002, one tip finally stood out. A woman called them and said the composite sketch of the suspect looked a lot like her ex-boyfriend, a man named Troy Graves. That immediately caught detectives' attention because his name was already on their list of 83 possible suspects. But that wasn't all. Not long after, another call came in, this time from a man who'd said he'd seen the description of the suspect's car, one that had been spotted by a victim. He told police his neighbor drove the exact same type of vehicle, and that his neighbor's name was again Troy Graves. When detectives started digging into his background, the pieces began to line up. Troy had worked at a bank located right in the same Philadelphia neighborhood where all the attacks took place. In 1999, right around the time the crimes suddenly stopped, he enlisted in the army. Not long after, he got written up for trying to force his way into a woman's room, though he denied it ever happened. Troy was stationed in Wyoming, but actually lived just across the state line, in Fort Collins, Colorado. So, he had lived in both cities where the attacks had occurred. When investigators tracked down his ex-girlfriend, she told them something else unsettling. Troy often went out for night walks and would come home with scratches and bruises he couldn't explain. To top it off, Troy's blood type matched the one found at Shannon's crime scene. Everything pointed to him as their guy, so detectives decided it was time to talk to him. They went to his house, but he wasn't at home, and one of them slipped a business card into the door. Later, Troy's wife, the woman he'd been married to for about a year, found the card and called the detective back. She said her husband was currently on a military base, but she'd speak to him about the message. Troy agreed to meet with police, but detectives didn't want to take any chances. They sent undercover officers to quietly keep tabs on him, just in case he tried to run. Eventually, Troy showed up at the station, and detectives started with usual routine questions. They noted he had no criminal record, asked him about the incident in the army that got him written up, and then moved on to the assaults in both cities and the murder of Shannon Schieber. Troy denied everything, but when the detectives asked him to provide his fingerprints and a DNA sample, he went completely silent for about 6 seconds. Then, he said he'd be willing to do it, but only after talking to his wife first. He promised to come back and give the samples the next day. At that point, the detectives told him he was under arrest. Officers immediately took his fingerprints and DNA, and when the results came back, they were a perfect match to the blood and semen found in Shannon's apartment, as well as all the other evidence from the assaults in both Philadelphia and Colorado. On April 23rd, Troy Graves was charged with 6 counts of sexual assault in Colorado, 27 charges in total. A few days later, Pennsylvania prosecutors added another 50 counts for the attacks there, including the murder of Shannon Schieber. After his arrest, a few surprising details surfaced. One of Troy's ex-girlfriends had recognized him from the composite sketch on the news long before police figured out who he was, but for some reason, she never came forward. And it turned out that Philadelphia police had actually stopped Troy's car back in January of 1999, right in the middle of the manhunt for Shannon's killer. They talked to him briefly, then let him go, completely unaware that the man they were looking for had been sitting right in front of them. Meanwhile, the question of where Troy would be tried first was still up in the air. In Colorado, he was facing a long prison sentence for the assaults, but in Pennsylvania, he could be sentenced to death for Shannon's murder. While that was being decided, Troy told his attorney he was ready to confess to everything, as long as prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. And in the end, both states accepted the deal. Before finalizing it, prosecutors spoke with Shannon's parents, and they made their stance very clear. They were firmly against the death penalty, no matter what. Even if Troy didn't confess, they said they couldn't support taking another life. Their faith forbade killing in any form, and they weren't willing to betray their beliefs, even after losing their daughter. They also reached out to all of Troy's surviving victims from Philadelphia and Fort Collins, and every single one of them stood behind that decision. Shannon's parents pointed out something else too, something much deeper. They believed that if police had taken earlier reports of sexual assault more seriously, they would have realized a serial predator was operating in their city long before Shannon was killed, and maybe, just maybe, their daughter would still be alive. The public, however, largely disagreed. Many people didn't understand how Shannon's parents wanted to spare her killer's life. But despite the backlash, they never wavered, and eventually, the plea deal went through. After that, Troy laid out every detail of what happened the night Shannon was killed. He said he broke into her apartment through the balcony while she was in the bedroom. Startled, Shannon tried to fight him off. She clawed at his face and even bit his finger. That's when Troy started choking her. She eventually lost consciousness, and he thought he'd snapped her neck. Moments later, he heard knocking at the door, but he insisted that whoever was there never identified themselves as police. He also claimed he didn't see any patrol cars outside when he escaped through the balcony. Still, there were some strange inconsistencies in his confession. Troy said he had closed the balcony door behind him as he left, but Shannon's brother clearly remembered that the door was wide open the next morning. Despite those details, his guilt was undeniable. The DNA, the evidence, the confession, it all pointed straight at him. On May 17th, Troy Graves was sentenced to life in prison for 6 counts of sexual assault in Colorado. After that, he was transferred to Pennsylvania, where he received another life sentence for Shannon's murder, plus an additional 60 to 120 years for the sexual assaults in Philadelphia. So Troy will spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for Shannon's parents, the story didn't end there. Her father filed a lawsuit against the Philadelphia Police Department, arguing that Shannon might still be alive if detectives had connected the earlier assaults and launched a proper investigation. The court, however, ruled that the police weren't responsible for her death, and no one was held accountable. Still, the case drew so much public attention that city officials eventually formed a special committee to review hundreds of ignored sexual assault reports that had piled up over the years. Shannon's parents also kept fighting against the death penalty, traveling across the country to speak in more than 20 states. Her mother even expressed a wish to visit Troy in prison and speak with him face to face, though whether that meeting ever happened remains unknown. Today, Troy Graves is still serving his sentence, with virtually no chance of ever walking free again. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.